Someone is lying to you about Rolex. And when we ran the actual numbers, the failure everyone is talking about simply wasn't there. What we found instead was a completely different story. One the internet got almost entirely wrong. Maybe you've already seen it. The thumbnail with the shattered crown, the red text, the presenter with a grave expression tells you that the king of watches is finished, that this is the biggest collapse in luxury history. Here's the problem. We cross-referenced analyst reports, pulled the legal filings, traced every claim back to its source, and what we found wasn't a collapse story. We found 7 things. Starting with the smallest lie, building toward the one part of this story that actually matters. One more thing before we start. This is not a defense of Rolex. Some of what you're about to hear is uncomfortable for the brand, but it's accurate. Number 7. The number that never existed. $32 billion. Say it out loud. It sounds enormous. It sounds real. It sounds like the kind of number that, if it disappeared, would absolutely constitute one of the biggest business disasters in recent history. There's one problem. It doesn't exist. Not in any report, not in any valuation, not in any court document, earnings filing, or industry analysis attached to Rolex specifically. It is a number that was assembled from somewhere, probably the combined export figures of the entire Swiss watch industry. All 300 brands, Rolex, Omega, Tag Heuer, Cartier, Patek Philippe, the names you know and the names you don't, folded into one, then multiplied by some retail markup estimate, then assigned entirely to Rolex, and then repeated until it sounded like fact. Here is what is actually real. Rolex crossed 11 billion Swiss francs in annual revenue in 2025. This is around $14 billion when converted. The first time in their history, a landmark number by any measure in this industry. Their brand value, depending on the methodology, sits somewhere between $10 billion and $18.8 billion. Still an almost incomprehensible amount for a company that makes watches. Still, the most dominant single brand in the history of Swiss watchmaking. But not 32 billion, not even close. Why does the fake number matter so much? Because the entire collapse story is built on it. The fall from 32 billion only lands as a dramatic headline if 32 billion was real in the first place. Fell 30% from a number that was invented? That's not a fall. That's just fiction with a calculator attached to it. Before we've even left number 7, the foundation of the collapse narrative is already gone. But pull up a chair, because what's underneath it is genuinely more interesting than the panic. There are parts of the Rolex picture that are genuinely worth scrutinizing, real things that happened, real money that moved, real questions about what the next decade looks like for a brand that has never had to answer to anyone. Number 6 pulls back the curtain on a structure so unusual that it makes the entire concept of Rolex failing almost logically impossible. The shield nobody mentions. Here's a question that almost nobody asks when they're making the Rolex is collapsing video. Who does Rolex answer to? Think about how most big companies die. Not in a single dramatic crash, that's for movies. In real life, companies die through pressure, a bad quarter, shareholders who need the stock to perform, an activist investor who shows up with an open letter demanding cost cuts, brand extensions, licensing deals, and a cheaper product line aimed at a broader audience. Everything that made the company worth something gets slowly sold off, piece by piece, to keep the share price alive for one more earnings call. That mechanism, that specific pressure system, Rolex doesn't have it. Not one piece of it. Go back to 1945. Hans Wilsdorf has built Rolex from a small London watch import operation into something the entire world recognizes. His wife has just died. He has no children. And he is sitting with a question that most founders in his position prefer not to think about. What happens to this after I'm gone? He could sell. There would have been serious buyers. He could structure an exit, take the money, and walk away. He could leave it to relatives who had nothing to do with what he'd built. Instead, he transferred the entire company, 100% of Rolex, to a private charitable foundation registered under Swiss law, the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. And when he died in 1960, that structure became permanent. There are no Rolex shareholders. Not public ones, not private ones, not a single person on Earth who owns a piece of Rolex and can demand it perform differently to protect their investment. The profits flow up to the foundation, which uses them to fund charitable work in Geneva, schools, cultural projects, community programs, and reinvests the rest back into the company. The foundation reportedly has around 300 million Swiss francs available for charitable giving every year. That figure comes after running the most profitable watch company in history. Picture what this actually means in practice. When Rolex decides to make fewer watches, there is no board meeting where shareholders vote to override it. When Rolex decides to raise prices instead of chasing volume, no investor can send a letter demanding something different. When Rolex says no to a licensing deal that would dilute the brand, no earnings pressure forces the conversation back open. You cannot collapse a company that has no debt, no shareholders, no stock price, and a foundation structure that has been insulating it from conventional business pressure for 65 years. The internet keeps applying the logic of publicly traded companies to a company that operates like nothing else in existence. It's like trying to diagnose a fish for not being able to climb a tree. The process doesn't apply. The business failure story doesn't just fall apart here. It becomes structurally incoherent. One thing worth saying, though, financial immunity is not the same as cultural immunity. You can be completely untouchable on a balance sheet and still lose something that matters far more and is far harder to rebuild. We'll get there. First, let's talk about the money that actually did disappear, and whose money it really was. The bubble that was never Rolex's bubble. Go back to 2021. The world has just spent a year locked inside. There is excess cash everywhere, stimulus payments, unspent travel budgets, savings that had nowhere to go. Interest rates are at historic lows. Crypto is making ordinary people rich overnight. NFTs are selling for millions of dollars, and nobody fully understands why. And somewhere in all that chaos, a community of buyers figures out that Rolex watches, specifically the ones hardest to get, are behaving exactly like assets. Tangible, wearable, and globally understood as valuable. A steel Submariner retailing at around $9,000 was flipping on the secondary market for $15,000, $16,000, sometimes $18,000 the same week it was purchased. A steel Daytona, retailing at around $14,000, was clearing $25,000 on trading platforms. People who had never cared about the history of the brand, never cared about what movement was inside the case, couldn't tell you the difference between a bidirectional bezel and a unidirectional one. Those people were walking into authorized dealers and walking straight back out to resell. The waiting list, which had always been a gatekeeping mechanism, became a money printer. Get on the list. Wait. Sell immediately on delivery. Repeat. Rolex watches became, for a concentrated period, something between a luxury good and a financial instrument, a store of value, a way to park cash in something tangible while everything else felt uncertain. Then 2022 arrived. Interest rates started climbing aggressively. Crypto imploded. The appetite for speculative assets cooled sharply across the board, from tech stocks to digital art to pre-owned Daytonas. And secondary Rolex prices, which had been held up entirely by speculative demand with very little connection to the actual cost of making the watch, started to fall. Not slowly. The peak landed in the first quarter of 2022, and the decline was almost continuous from there. By 2024, secondary market prices had given back nearly everything gained since January 2021. Gray market dealers who had loaded their inventories at bubble prices, Submariners, GMT Masters, Daytonas bought for resale at peak premiums, were now holding stock worth significantly less than what they'd paid. Think about what that looks like in a real showroom. A dealer in a major city who spent $400,000 building a steel sports watch inventory in early 2022 is sitting on that same stock valued at roughly $280,000 by 2024. The watches are still there, still ticking, still beautiful, just worth a lot less than what he paid. Meanwhile, the monthly costs keep arriving. Insurance, storage, and the rent on a showroom that now has more watches in it than customers browsing them. Phone calls are going unanswered. inquiry emails from buyers offering 20% below, asking, then 30%. The squeeze is quiet, and it doesn't stop. Some of these dealers had borrowed to buy at the peak. That made everything sharper. Carrying costs on depreciating inventory funded by debt is one of the more unpleasant business positions you can find yourself in. And the exit isn't clean: sell at a loss and crystallize the damage, or hold and hope the market recovers while the costs accumulate. Neither option is comfortable. That is the collapse story. That is where the real damage was. That is the pain behind the headlines. And it is completely, entirely the dealer's problem. Here is the part every headline missed. Rolex sold those watches to authorized dealers at official retail prices. The moment any watch left an authorized counter, whatever happened to its value in the secondary market had nothing to do with Rolex's revenue, Rolex's balance sheet, or Rolex's business in any way. The speculation happened between third parties. The correction happened between those same third parties. Rolex collected its money before any of the drama started. It was never in the flipper economy. The flippers attached themselves to Rolex. When they lost their own money. There's even an argument, a credible one, that the correction helped the brand. The speculators left. The people who actually wanted to wear the watch could suddenly find one without paying a stranger double the retail price. The authorized dealer relationship, which had been completely distorted by resale culture, started to function again. The brand got its community back from the people who'd been renting it. The bubble popped. Rolex watched from the other side of a glass wall, having already been paid. Let's talk about what Rolex did next. A move so counterintuitive that the first time you hear it, it sounds like a mistake. The year they deliberately made less. Most companies facing a market correction reach for the same instincts. Lower prices to protect volume, broaden distribution to find new buyers, push more product into more channels. When things get harder, the standard response is to try harder. In 2025, Rolex went the other direction on every single count. Production went down roughly 2%. Fewer watches were made than the year before. Retail prices up 6% across the catalog in January 2026. Steel models, gold models, and the full range. And at the end of it all, the single best financial year in the company's history. Fewer units, higher prices, record revenue. This is not an accident. It has a name in the industry, growth through scarcity, and it requires a specific kind of conviction to execute when the headlines are questioning your future. The logic goes like this. The moment a luxury product becomes easy to acquire, it changes what it is. Not in any technical sense, the watch is the same, but in the sense that matters most to the buyer, in the meaning attached to ownership, in the feeling that comes with wearing it. Exclusivity is not a side effect of the Rolex experience. For a significant portion of the brand's most valuable customers, exclusivity is the product. The wait list, the relationship with the authorized dealer, the phone call that arrives after months. Take that away, and you have a very well-made watch. Keep it, and you have something people will wait years for. Rolex had watched what happened to brands that forgot this. Labels that chased volume, that pushed the product into outlet channels and broadened distribution to hit revenue targets. That ended up with their bags on discount racks and their logo associated with easy access rather than earned acquisition. The recovery from that, if it comes at all, takes decades. They looked at those cautionary tales and built the exact opposite. But that wasn't the only move. While the gray market was contracting, Rolex was quietly building a direct competitor to it. The certified pre-owned program, Rolex authenticating used watches through its own authorized dealer network and reselling them with the brand's own warranty, generated over $530 million in 2025, more than 60% up from the year before. Walk into an authorized dealer now, and you'll find used Rolexes sitting alongside new ones. Same showroom, same trained staff, same lighting and presentation. Brand authenticated, brand warrantied. A box with the Rolex name on it, the service records inside, the confidence that the watch you're buying is exactly what it says it is. The gray market dealers who had been doing this business for decades suddenly found themselves not just competing with each other, but competing with Rolex itself for the same used inventory, the same buyers, the same trust. And in that contest, who do most buyers trust more? The gray market dealer on a platform or the brand's own authorized showroom? The answer is fairly obvious. The company that makes the watch became the most trusted place to buy a used one. Rolex didn't just survive the correction. It identified a revenue category that the correction had cleared space for and moved directly into it. 1 million watches produced. 33% of the entire Swiss watch industry. Record revenue. Making less, earning more. Number 3 is where a government stepped in. A ruling that exposed something Rolex had been quietly relying on for over a decade. The $100 million verdict. December 2023. The French competition authority, the Autorité de la Concurrence, issues its ruling. Rolex is fined 91.6 million euros, just under $100 million. Official, documented, legally binding, and publicly recorded. This one is completely real. The charge covers more than a decade of behavior. For that entire period, Rolex had explicitly prohibited its authorized retailers from selling watches online. Not discouraged, prohibited. Any authorized dealer who attempted to build a digital sales channel, even a simple one, even a limited one, was in direct breach of their Rolex contract. The French regulator concluded that blocking an entire distribution channel, not for legitimate brand protection reasons, but to control pricing and eliminate competitive pressure, was a serious violation of competition law. Rolex's defense had some internal logic. Online environments make authentication harder. Counterfeiting is a genuine and ongoing problem in the watch industry. The brand experience, the case presentation, the trained staff, the careful lighting, and the physical weight of the watch in your hand disappear on a product page. These are real concerns, and Rolex wasn't manufacturing them entirely. The regulator rejected the argument anyway, and the specific reason it was rejected is the part that cuts deepest, because Rolex, while publicly claiming that online sales were fundamentally incompatible with its brand standards, had already constructed and launched an online sales platform for its own certified, pre-owned program. The company was actively selling second-hand Rolexes online through its own authorized network, while simultaneously preventing its dealer partners from doing anything similar. The same brand that said the internet wasn't appropriate for its products was already using the internet to sell its products, just exclusively through a channel that Rolex itself controlled. The regulator saw that, documented it, and concluded that the online ban had never been about brand protection. It had been about the control of distribution. Fine, confirmed. 91.6 million euros. No appeal. Now, the context that matters. Rolex generated 11 billion Swiss francs in revenue in 2025. The fine represents roughly 4 days of revenue. It is not a rounding error, it is genuine money. But it does not threaten the company's strategy, its market position, or its long-term trajectory. It does not require asset sales. It does not require financing. It gets absorbed. What it signals, and this is the part worth tracking, is that European regulators are increasingly willing to examine how dominant luxury brands structure their distribution relationships. The conversation about what a brand can legally demand of its retail partners, what restrictions are acceptable, and which ones constitute anti-competitive control, is now legally active in a way it wasn't before this ruling. Other brands are watching. Their lawyers are certainly watching. For Rolex specifically, a hit. A real and documented one, not a fall. The next point doesn't show up in any financial report. But the people who have cared about watches the longest are already sensing it. What the numbers cannot capture. Revenue is at a record, market share is dominant, foundation untouchable, production strategy working, and pre-owned business accelerating. By every financial measure, nothing is wrong. So, what is the actual concern? Spend time with serious watch collectors. Not the buyers who picked up a Submariner in 2021 as a financial play and got caught in the correction. The people who have been in this world for 15 or 20 years, who tracks reference numbers, production variations, and dial changes the way other people track football statistics. Who built their collections over decades because they genuinely love what these objects are. Talk to those people today, and something has shifted. Nothing loud, Nothing that announces itself in a headline, but it's there. Walk into a watch meetup in any major city right now. Pay attention to the wrists and the conversations happening around them. You will still see Rolexes, plenty of them. But listen to what people are excited about, what they're recommending, what they're hunting. The energy has diversified in a way it hadn't before 2020. Cartier Santos references Vacheron overseas models. Independents most people outside the hobby have never heard of. The watch community has always had breadth, but the gravitational center that used to pull most conversations back to Rolex seems slightly less strong than it was. The conversation around Rolex in those circles is more complicated than it was 5 years ago. More qualified, more likely to include a pause before the recommendation. Some have moved toward Cartier, some toward Vacheron Constantin, some toward independent makers producing a few hundred pieces a year, whose waiting lists feel earned differently. The tone has changed from certainty to something more like consideration. Here is why that matters more than it looks on the surface. Between 2020 and 2022, Rolex became culturally associated with a type of buyer it had never been primarily defined by before. The crypto trader is wearing a Submariner as a hedge. The reseller, who couldn't name the movement inside the case. The buyer for whom the watch was purely a social signal and the craftsmanship entirely incidental. Rolex's visibility exploded during those years. More people knew the brand, more people wanted in. But the meaning attached to ownership shifted in ways the brand couldn't fully control. Serious collectors noticed. They're still noticing. And that community, while not the largest part of Rolex's customer base by volume, is arguably the most important by influence. These are the people younger buyers with growing budgets turn to for direction. When someone with 20 years in horology tells a newcomer what to explore, that shapes purchasing decisions for the next decade. When the answer that used to point consistently toward Rolex starts occasionally pointing elsewhere, even slightly, even on certain days, that shift compounds quietly over time. Taste is contagious, and it moves slowly until suddenly it doesn't. Add to this that the ultra-high-end watch market has genuinely expanded its options in the last decade. For a buyer spending over $200,000 on a single piece, the prestigious shortlist is longer and more genuinely competitive than it was 10 years ago. Cartier is drawing serious collector interest among younger, wealthy buyers in a way that feels organic rather than manufactured. Vacheron is gaining critical credibility among people who might previously have defaulted to Patek Philippe. Independent watchmakers who were virtually unknown outside specialist circles a decade ago now have multi-year waiting lists and auction records that command serious attention. Rolex's position at the apex of Swiss watchmaking is not in immediate danger. The revenue makes that clear. But the cultural work of staying there, of remaining the instinctive answer when serious people ask what to desire, is less settled than it was before the hype years. This is the kind of problem that no balance sheet captures and no production strategy solves. It is a perception question, a meaningful question, and it will take years, possibly a full generation of new collectors, to fully understand whether the speculation era left a permanent mark or whether Rolex's gravitational pull reasserts itself over time. The numbers say the crown is secure. The culture is asking a question the numbers can't answer. Number one is the real picture underneath all the noise, and what any of this actually means for you. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part, what actually happened and what it means. Strip it all back. The $32 billion figure is fabricated. It was never attached to Rolex in any credible source. It was invented to make a subsequent percentage drop sound catastrophic. The real revenue hit 11 billion Swiss francs in 2025 for the first time in the company's history. Not a fall from a peak. The peak itself arrived while the collapse headlines were being written. The company is owned by a charitable foundation with no shareholders, no debt, no stock price to protect, and no quarterly earnings call to survive. The mechanism by which companies conventionally fail: investor pressure, activist campaigns, leveraged exposure, and forced asset sales. None of those apply here. Hans Wilsdorf built a structure in 1945 that insulates this company from every conventional business pressure. You cannot foreclose on the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. You cannot send a letter demanding a cheaper product line. The concept doesn't translate, and it never will. The gray market collapse was real, and the losses were significant. Dealers who bought inventory at bubble prices lost serious money when the correction came. Businesses got squeezed. Some didn't survive. Their pain was genuine, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But it was their pain. Rolex sold at retail into its authorized network and collected its revenue before any of the secondary drama began. The flippers lost their own money. Rolex lost nothing. The production cut was a deliberate strategy, not a retreat. 1 million watches, 33% of the market, record revenue. The certified pre-owned program generated over $530 million in 2025 by moving directly into the secondary market space, which had been destabilized. Rolex didn't just weather the gray market chaos. It identified a new business inside that chaos and moved into it while the chaos was still ongoing. The French fine was real. 91.6 million euros for blocking authorized dealers from selling online for over a decade. A genuine legal finding, a real precedent, and a signal that European regulators are watching distribution practices in luxury more carefully than before. 4 days of revenue, absorbed. And the brand perception question, the quiet drift in how serious collectors talk about Rolex, the cultural residue left by 3 years of speculative association, the emerging competition from brands building credibility among exactly the buyers Rolex most needs to keep, that remains genuinely open, not a crisis today. A slow-moving question that no revenue figure answers, and that will take a generation to fully resolve. So, what actually happened? A speculative bubble formed around a brand during a period of excess liquidity and pandemic-era obsession with scarce assets. Speculators attached themselves to it because Rolex was the most recognizable name available, not because they had any particular relationship with what the brand makes. When macroeconomic conditions normalized, the bubble corrected. The speculators absorbed losses. Some of them went looking for a narrative that explained their situation more comfortably than "we bought at the top of a mania." The fall of Rolex gave them one. It spread. It found an audience that didn't check where the number came from. The brand, meanwhile, was on the other side of a wall that had been standing since 1960. It raised prices, cut production, built a new revenue stream, reported the best year in its history. The fall of Rolex made for a great thumbnail. The actual story is a 120-year-old company owned by a foundation set up by a man who died in 1960 with no shareholders and no debt, running the most dominant single-brand operation in the history of Swiss watchmaking, while the internet films its eulogy. The king is still on the throne. The people who tried to use the crown as a slot machine lost their stake. Those are two completely different stories. One of them got the Kansas views, you just saw the other. So that is the full picture. The pattern you just watched isn't unique to Rolex, a made-up baseline, a real correction pinned on the wrong party, a genuine hit stripped of scale, a structural advantage no one mentions. That combination shows up constantly in how business stories travel online. Not always because someone is deliberately lying, because panic spreads faster than fact-checking, because a cracked crown is a better image than a record revenue year. Knowing how to read those stories, knowing where to check the number, whose money actually moved, what structure is actually in play, that is worth more than any single verdict on any single brand. If this kind of investigation is what you're looking for, the actual story underneath the noise, on luxury brands, business, and money, then subscribe and hit the bell. Every video we make is built the same way. Primary sources, real numbers, no invented baselines. Drop your take in the comments. Are you still on a waitlist? Did you get caught in the gray market correction? Do you think the brand fatigue question is bigger than I'm suggesting? Or is Rolex too dominant to care? The conversation is open. See you in the next one.